Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. This is somewhat familiar territory. I grew up in Connecticut and down in Fairfield County, and my aunt is in Mystic, and my father has a house in Stonington. I applied to Connecticut College, so this is a coming home. I've also had some fascination with New London, not only in some research I've dabbled in concerning property rights and eminent domain and the infamous Little Pink House, but also for economic development and city building initiatives in New London, and some interest in the land value tax, which is something that we do a lot of research on at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, think tank in Cambridge and Harvard Square. Well, for those of you who have seen the King's Speech, how many have seen the King's Speech? Well, what I'm going to attempt to do here, my aspirations anyway, are along the lines of the film's conclusion. That is my hope anyway. And I want to try to do a couple of things for this evening address. I want to sort of immerse ourselves in the story of Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses. But then I want to extrapolate a bit and use that story. I personally believe it's a great narrative, it's a great story, a fun story, but to look at it, at what lessons might be learned from that clash in terms of both neighborhood building and things like infrastructure to support cities, and ultimately the big takeaway, the current state of play in smart growth, the triumphs of that movement in recent years, but the very, very serious challenges ahead. So let's start with the leading characters to get underway. She was the young woman from Scranton with no college degree and who shunned credentials, moved to New York and fell in love with its old neighborhoods, became a savvy community activist, and at the same time wrote a book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, that revolutionized planning and changed the way we think about cities. He was the power broker, dapper and swaggering, on the swim team at Yale, PhD from Oxford, who single-handedly built the New York we know today. Its bridges and byways, parks and swimming pools, Jones Beach, the UN building, Shea Stadium, and the housing towers that rose up in the era of urban renewal. Now, make no mistake, this is a David and Goliath story. Jane Jacobs developed a critique of urban renewal and the excesses of modernism that prompted an important redirection of policy initiatives a half-century ago. Her keen eye and appreciation for the human scale of urban neighborhoods endures in principles that are uniformly embraced by the planning and design professions to this day. But Robert Moses has much to teach us as well, I'd like to argue. He had energy and leadership and vision, and he knew how to navigate a bureaucracy. He was a master at seizing the moment, seeing the opportunities at the local and regional level when the federal government came to the table with funding. We can only guess what he might have done with the sustainability grants that HUD and EPA and DOT have begun to distribute, guiding perhaps a new greener urban future for places like New London. He was a product of his time, to be sure, and The Clash is good theater, but we can learn from them both about how our great cities can thrive today. And here's the starting point, that cities are the greenest form of human settlement that we can aspire to as we grapple with the challenges of energy and climate change. We have our first urban president in a long time, and cities have rightly taken center stage. There where 80% of the population lives, and not only have great potential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, they're economic engines and hubs of innovation in a new green economy. They're places of density and mixed use and transit, places where we can walk and ride a bike. All across the country, cities are hard at work, building on their assets, doing infill and redevelopment, taking advantage of established and expanded transit. And all of this is in stark contrast to the sprawling subdivisions and strip malls of the last half century. It's really quite remarkable that urbanism in cities and sustainability and smart growth and new urbanism have become such accepted principles and policy today. Many forces have coalesced around this idea of a necessarily post-oil and post-carbon future. The opportunities are legion, and cities and metropolitan regions have such a critical center stage role to play. Well, let's take a look at how Jane Jacobs showed the way. Jane Bunstner, her maiden name, grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the daughter of a Methodist doctor who drove around town in a convertible sports car with no windscreen and told her daughter there was nothing she couldn't do. She moved to New York in the 1930s and started to look for a newspaper job, with two strikes against her, being a woman and being in the midst of the Great Depression. So she put a nickel in the subway after one particularly short interview one morning, and went out and explored her new city and discovered Greenwich Village, what would become the model mixed-use, walkable, human-scale neighborhood. She came back, she was living with her sister Betty, and came back, they were in Brooklyn, and she came back and said, "Betty, I found the place we have to live." And Betty said, "Really? Where is it?" And Jane said, "I don't know, but you get in the subway and you get off at a place called Christopher Street." Now, she didn't immediately realize her dream of being a journalist, taking a job as a secretary, but she did what good enterprising writers do. She freelanced. She wrote articles for Vogue magazine about the flower business in New York, the jewelry district, about what was underneath all the manhole covers in Manhattan. Her full-time writing and editing positions came with a magazine called Iron Age and America, a publication of the State Department, where she's pictured here, and then later Architectural Forum. In 1944, she married Bob Jacobs, an architect working for Grumman at the time. They bought 555 Hudson Street in the West Village in 1947 for $7,000. And by the way, that block has been renamed Jane Jacobs Way, and also, by the way, that building was recently sold for $3.5 million. They raised 3 children, Jim, Ned, and Mary, and she was happy as a writer and began to immerse herself in urban planning, architecture, and urban design, participating in this University of Pennsylvania conference with some of the leading thinkers and practitioners of the day, including Louis Kahn, Kevin Lynch, and Ian McCarr. It was here that she began a relationship with the Rockefeller Foundation, which gave her the grant to write her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. She was happy in this life, riding around with her bike with a basket in the front to Midtown from Greenwich Village, raising the kids. But around 1955, something caught her attention, a proposal to extend Fifth Avenue through Washington Square Park. This was a proposal by Robert Moses, and that really can be our first lesson, is that you don't mess with a mother with a stroller who uses a park near her home. Now, Moses, by that time, was Parks Commissioner with and that was one of several appointed positions. At one point he had 12 appointed positions all at the same time. He was never elected to anything, and he ran for governor in 1934, but he was a terrible candidate, and he was soundly defeated, and went back to where he was most influential, which was sort of behind the scenes, and as a chairman and commissioners of various agencies. While Jacobs and Moses share some things in common, singularly hard-charging self-starters, and they both wrote poetry too, Moses' background couldn't have been more different. He had servants in his Upper East Side apartment and was ferried around in limousines, so much so that he actually never learned to drive. As a young Jewish man at Yale, he had to fight his way into the most prestigious student organizations he could get into, and edited an alternative literary journal when the top shelf publication wouldn't have him. He was determined to be a Rhodes Scholar and traveled to the UK even when the program wasn't available that year. And he relished his Oxford education so much that he returned to New York not only with a PhD, but an affected English accent. After serving as right-hand man to New York Governor Alfred Smith, who called him the best darn bill drafter in Albany, Moses plunged into his work building parks and parkways, beginning, of course, in Long Island. He created his masterpiece, Jones Beach, and by the 1930s, the base of power had become the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, which had its own fleet of vehicles, its own police force, its own logo, and headquarters under the Triborough Bridge on Randall's Island, which Moses used as his primary lair. He was so good at using New Deal money to fund bridges and tunnels and roads and parks, Mayor LaGuardia tapped him to be Parks Commissioner, and he later served on major housing commissions geared to the post-war policy of urban renewal. It was part of an extraordinary package, really a reinvention of the city that was underway. Indeed, Moses had proposed the roadway through Washington Square Park to lead to this project, Washington Square Southeast, classic towers in the park, inspired by the Swiss-born architect Le Corbusier. The folks in this project, Moses said, had been promised a Fifth Avenue address, so naturally he had to extend Fifth Avenue through the park. Well, Washington Square Park was where Jacobs began as a community activist, as a foot soldier and a member of the committee, and she was good at it, arranging photo ops like this one. This is a ribbon tying ceremony. Of course, when there's great public works projects, the politicians like to cut ribbons. Well, this was a ribbon tying, suggesting there would be no such celebration. But it was the bulldozers of urban renewal and the Moses program of slum removal, vividly seen in projects like Lincoln Center and in East Harlem, that propelled Jacobs to the next level. Picture this, she's at 555 Hudson Street, having just written The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and she learns by reading the newspaper that 14 blocks of the West Village, including the very block she had just described in the manuscript as the place of the sidewalk ballet, were slated for slum designation and ultimately erasure to make way for more drab housing towers. This is the part of the story where Jacobs really blazes a trail, holding court in the Lion's Head, setting up further photo ops, and disrupting planning commission meetings by having the audacity to speak up. The city fathers were not used to this kind of behavior. She actually had a mole in City Hall that let her know when some key meetings were being held, because there was no public announcements of when these meetings on slum designation would actually be held. So she showed the denizens of Greenwich Village that it was possible to fight City Hall. This is a particular time. It was around about 1961. Bob Dylan had just come to town, and the times were just beginning to change. But it took great courage, I think, to challenge the establishment in this way. She showed that the grand schemes that came from the planners and from their drafting tables, without citizen input, were not inevitable. The ultimate battle was over one of the crosstown expressways that Robert Moses had proposed, the Lower Manhattan Expressway, or Lomex as it was called. The others were the Mid-Manhattan Expressway, another expressway at 125th Street, and of course the one that did get built, which was the Cross Bronx Expressway. But it's amazing to think today that a 10-lane elevated expressway could be roaring down Broome Street in Soho, some of the most wonderful and valuable urban real estate in the country, with its lofts and cast iron building facades. But that was the plan, to relieve congestion and connect excuse me, the Holland and Williamsburg, the Holland Tunnel and the Williamsburg and Manhattan bridges. There it is, snaking through lower Manhattan. To fight it, Jane Jacobs teamed up with a soft-spoken minister, politicians from the left and right, and even some interesting characters from Little Italy at the time, if you know what I mean. All the while, she enticed reporters to question the wisdom of blasting highways through urban neighborhoods that were functioning places of jobs and communities and housing. And again, it was this audacity to speak up. She was like Rachel Carson and Erin Brockovich all rolled into one. Landed her in trouble, specifically in the back of a squad car in April 1968, when she was arrested for, ultimately the charge was inciting a riot at a particularly raucous public hearing on Lomex. This ended with the stenotype record of the hearing being torn up into shreds and thrown around like confetti. Jane left New York in 1968 for Toronto, where she would remain for the rest of her life, becoming a Canadian citizen, much loved in Toronto. Her clash with Moses marked the twilight of the power broker's career. After the Lower Manhattan Expressway, freeway revolts rose up all around the country, from Baltimore to San Francisco. More people questioned urban renewal and the too often paternalistic authority that implemented those policies. In the end, we got more public participation. We sort of take it as a given these days, but it really was a novel concept back then. And to this day, we see cities dismantling some of those elevated roadways, from New York to New Orleans, of course Portland, Oregon, Milwaukee, and Seattle. That, I think, in itself is a compelling legacy, but there's much more as we unpack all of this further. The lessons that we can bring as we sort of fast forward to today. One critical theme in our communities, equity, is one that Jane Jacobs and the revolution that she really started left somewhat unaddressed. She never really solved the dilemma of gentrification, though she tried with the West Village houses. What she called over-success is nowhere more evident than in Greenwich Village and Soho and the Meatpacking District in Manhattan today, where the more prominent Jacobs is Marc Jacobs, selling fabulous handbags and shoes, and prompting this flyer, which is in circulation in the area. Today, there are important innovations to address equity and economic diversity. Inclusionary zoning, inclusionary housing, community land trusts is another area of interest of ours at the Lincoln Institute. But it's a job that is far from done. Equity remains the single biggest challenge of revitalizing cities everywhere. And not just here, but around the world, where over half the planet's population now lives in cities and includes an estimated 1 billion people living in informal settlement without access to basic services, water and sanitation, electricity. The citizen activism that Jacobs pioneered as well, too often today becomes mere NIMBYism, not in my backyard. In this respect, just as Jacobs shouldn't be necessarily placed on a pedestal, nor should Moses be demonized. There's a Wall Street Journal headline recently, several months ago, that read, "Enough with Jane Jacobs already." Now, this was slightly disturbing for a biographer of Jane Jacobs, but it suggested that, you know, sort of like Lady Gaga, she had risked being overexposed. But really, the piece was about the process and how that had gotten bogged down, and in our cities, trying to reinvent themselves had led to a certain paralysis. Infill development, after all, is where all the action is. Vacant parcels, surface parking lots, unused government property, brownfields, transforming industrial waterfronts. And it's hard work. These are places where people live already. In New York today, I think you see some large projects like Atlantic Yards or the Coney Island rezoning plan greeted with kind of automatic skepticism. And I remember there were several young women who donned blonde bob wigs and black-rimmed glasses and participated in a protest at Coney Island. They were channeling Jane Jacobs and suggesting that she would not approve. But I worry about this kind of knee-jerk reaction. The urban design has to be right, but mayors like Michael Bloomberg are right to focus on infill development. There's a kind of stalemate at work in many of our cities today. In Boston, where there's an opportunity to fill a vacant lot next to a T station, the JFK UMass T station. Neighbors from the Savin Hill neighborhood, which is almost a mile away, have raised opposition. And that's just one of many stories about NIMBYism and this kind of stalemate that we see in our cities. I think it turns out that there's one thing that people hate as much as sprawl, and that's density. But we have to, that always gets a laugh among the planners, but maybe just among planners. I think we need to learn how to embrace density. As long as it's well designed and follows, indeed, the Jane Jacobs principles of being oriented around transit with a mix of uses, a nearby park and recreational space, human scaled and walkable. Although it doesn't have to just mean the three-story buildings of Hudson Street. The towers of Vancouver are an example of verticality and density that's appropriate in many of our cities, including Boston along the Greenway, which is the focus of some urban infill redevelopment proposals. Well, let's take some time out to look at some data to show why all this is important. There's a recent EPA study that really confirms the findings of Growing Cooler, which was done by the Urban Land Institute and Smart Growth America, establishing some links among density and VMT, vehicle miles traveled. You see here in this graph with conventional suburban development, higher VMT, and with multifamily and transit-oriented development, much lower. And this is if even if you're driving a Prius, so it takes into account some of the green technology. We don't have a global agreement on climate change, and we don't have cap and trade or even an energy bill at the national level. But the land use and development dimension, what smart growth tries to achieve, more compact, mixed-use, transit-accessible, walkable communities can chip away at the problems of climate change and the need to move on from a fossil fuel-based economy. And it's all happening right here at the local level. Here's another graph that links the correlation between density and VMT. It's also increasingly what people want. There are some interesting changing demographics, some interesting new market demand trends. Studies by the National Association of Realtors shows how People really prefer the shorter commute and to live near transit. This is particularly relevant as gas begins to climb back towards $4 a gallon. The changing demographics include this being a country no longer really of the standard Ozzie and Harriet couple with 2 kids and a dog. Many more different kinds of households changing over time with different needs. There's a lot of right-sizing going on. Aging baby boomers, of which I guess I have to include myself, are moving into cities, and they're going there because they don't want to be in a retirement community or out on a golf course. They want to be in a vital neighborhood with access to all kinds of culture and activity. Arthur Nelson, Chris Nelson at the University of Utah, and Dal Myers at UCLA have both done some interesting work on what might be called the Great Housing Reset. This looks at, as aging baby boomers are making these moves back into cities, and they're trying to sell their house, the prediction is that they're going to have a very tough time because there won't be the demand. There won't be very many buyers. The suggestion is we're easily overbuilt in this country by nearly 30 million single-family homes. The more recent phenomenon has been one of what's been called zombie subdivisions, or premature subdivisions. These are areas that are platted but empty, and there's virtually no chance that these developments will ever be built out. These areas on the periphery, the aerial image is from Teton Valley in Idaho. Really just a chance to reset our expectations and some of these land use patterns, and think about what the actual fiscal impacts are of this kind of dispersed development. I would argue we don't need to build any more single-family homes in subdivisions. Sell your Toll Brothers stock because there's just not going to be the demand. There's going to be no one to buy them, and the smartest home builders indeed have started turning to multifamily and urban infill years ago. Well, if there is to be a new paradigm for smart growth, let's dig a little deeper and look behind the scenes and look at what needs to be adjusted to allow different patterns to flourish. I'm going to wow you with a particular catchphrase now: zoning reform. Now, I've really got your attention. But the truth is, even as some developers look to do more smart growth, it's illegal in many of our communities today. Zoning forbids it. Mixed use, housing over ground floor retail, density, fewer parking spaces. Miami has recently overhauled its zoning with a form-based code that is more concerned with the character and the collection of buildings than on the use that goes on inside them, and indeed the separation of uses that Euclidean zoning dictates. It's an initiative called Miami 21, and I encourage you to look it up. It's a zoning based on smart growth principles, and it's really changed the rules of the development game in that city. Salt Lake City has done something similar, going through all of their codes to encourage and indeed allow, in many cases, sustainability. They had rules, unnecessarily restrictive rules on accessory dwelling units, and you couldn't, there was one ordinance that said you couldn't grow crops anywhere around your house in a residential zone that were more than 2 feet tall. And so the mayor got rid of that, because if people want to grow corn and, or anything else, they should be allowed to with all the attention on local food and urban farming. And I think that is an important direction for smart growth, looking at zoning, looking at what's outdated, throwing it out, starting over. How else can smart growth be enabled, and how can cities and metropolitan regions and great neighborhoods be supported? Well, the answer lies in another sexy buzzword, and that's infrastructure. Keep your eye on figures like John Kerry and Ed Rendell, the former governor of Pennsylvania, in groups like America 2050 and Building America's Future. There's a growing recognition that we need a vision to drive a national agenda for key urban infrastructure. Not new highways and bridges to nowhere, but high-speed intercity rail, for example, and improved and expanded transit. These are some of the basic building blocks for our metropolitan regions. Now, we've all seen the headlines on high-speed rail and the Florida governor most recently returning the funds that the Obama administration has offered for the high-speed rail project in Central Florida. It could be that we have the one model project that we might really focus on right here down the road, the Acela, and turn that into truly high-speed rail, or at least higher-speed rail. And it really is a classic corridor as it serves a collection of cities, large and small, in what the Lincoln Institute and America 2050 we call mega regions. The Boston-Washington corridor being one example, the Pacific Northwest, and many others. Now, France and Japan and China have long since figured this out and recognized the payoff in such investments. The timing, of course, couldn't be worse. We are all particularly broke. But that's why I think it's going to take a lot of leadership and creativity if the pathway for smart growth is indeed infrastructure. It will take the kind of creativity and vision and innovation and leadership of the sort that Robert Moses practiced. Look for public-private partnerships as well, well used in other parts of the world, to become more of a part of the conversation here, as well as the notion of an infrastructure bank and other innovations in financing key infrastructure. Cisco and IBM as well have been looking at ways that technology can be used both in the planning of major projects and more efficient management of infrastructure. Well, there are many other pressing issues in Washington today, and the pressures to reduce spending are great. President Obama has talked about trying to both trim and invest. But the key piece of legislation will be the transportation bill, the reauthorization of the transportation bill. Some things have got to change this year if smart growth is going to continue on its new directions. It cannot be known, as in past years, as the highway bill. The DOT, in a remarkable break from the past, really, has already said all of its transport programs will be oriented around livability and sustainability. The budgets for transit will double, including addressing an $80 billion backlog of work in transit systems in our cities. This bill must not include pork. It must not call, indeed, for new projects at all, new highway projects at all. Rather, the key catchphrase is something a certain Republican governor from Massachusetts, Mitt Romney, put in place some years ago, and that is fix it first. This is the policy focusing on the infrastructure already in place in our cities and bringing them to a state of good repair. We might invest in transit and rail that supports a new green economy based in our cities that supports economic development with a transport network for goods and people, synchronized with solar panel manufacturers or wind turbine manufacturers and other businesses that cities as hubs of innovation can produce. That is the clarion call for smart growth today. Indeed, the spin-off from the national organization of Smart Growth America is Transportation for America, and they know where the rubber meets the road. I'm sorry, where the steel wheels meet the rails. So for all these reasons, the need for a meeting point between top-down and ground-up planning, the importance of infrastructure alongside the finer-grained urban design implementation, including, by the way, the burgeoning field of retrofitting suburban areas. As we look to the future of smart growth, it's going to require not silver bullets, but silver buckshot. Clearly, given the political climate today, the skepticism about government, the calls to reduce spending, the smart growth movement, despite its incredible gains over the past 10 years, and a sympathetic administration in the White House, is going to have to be even more nimble and convincing in its approach. So for all those reasons, Robert Moses' appreciation for infrastructure and getting things done, and Jane Jacobs' embrace of more organic and human-scale neighborhoods, the way she left us an owner's manual for the livable city. For smart growth and our cities to succeed, I would argue we need a little bit of both. Thank you very much.